Good morning, folks, and thank you all so much for coming out to the fourth of our live Q&As in our Royal Family series here at Curious Minds, led by the one and only Shinan Govani. Over the next 20 minutes or so, Shinan and I are going to be running through the excellent questions that you sent us in response to his lecture this week on the life and legacy of Princess Diana. There were no shortage of thought-provoking and passionate questions about this fascinating but sometimes polarizing figure in the history of the House of Windsor. It is as always a real pleasure and privilege to welcome Shinan back to our virtual stage to dive into those questions with us here on Friday mornings. Shinan, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you, Will. Good to meet again.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to dive into the House of Windsor with you on Friday mornings. And as I said, no shortage of strong and strongly opinionated questions about Diana and her legacy this week. So I want to dive right into it. Paula writes in with a really interesting question asking about Diana's closest confidants. Did she have people she could rely on for support and advice while negotiating the pressures of the press and her often dysfunctional relationship with the Windsors?
It's a question that often comes up in, when inspecting the lives of the super famous. It often seems they are very alone, and there is the question of who can they trust? Is there anyone they can trust? In the case of Diana, I'd like to maybe look at three different relationships, I think, which were impactful in her life. There was the relationship she had with her butler, Paul Burrell, and like many of the uber rich, the uber famous, who sort of tend to have a lot of paid friends, so to speak, Paul sort of fit into that category. After Diana died, he revealed that he'd been keeping a lot of her secrets, including her battle with bulimia. She was very close to him. She was one of the few people who knew that he was gay, which was not known at the time. He's kind of become a professional Dianaologist in the years that have followed her death. And she even left him some money in her will, which was unusual, according to some. There was also a relationship that is interesting to me that she had with a wealthy heiress, Jemima Khan, who was known as Jemima Goldsmith, I guess, earlier. She's the daughter of the famous mogul James Goldsmith. Her insider crowd in London, she's right in the core of it. The private club Annabelle's in London is named after her mother. Now, they hit it off in particular later on in Diana's life because Jemima had married Imran Khan, the famous Pakistani cricket player, who is now currently the prime minister of Pakistan. He was the cricket player turned prime minister. But back then, when Diana was having this affair with Hasnat, the heart surgeon that we talked about a little bit in our lecture on Diana, she leaned on Jemima, asking her about, the customs in Pakistan, about dating a Muslim man. So they sort of bonded over that. So that's an interesting sort of relationship. And thirdly, I think the relationship between Diana and Fergie, who both came up at the same time, is also interesting because they seem to be best friends, rivals, and everything in between. Their relationship is worth noting in the history of the royals, in particular because it actually precedes them marrying into the royals. Their families were friends even before, and they were actually fourth cousins. They were both descended from William Cavendish, the fourth Duke of Devonshire. Maybe people do not know that. It is also said that Diana played a little bit of a matchmaker and sort of in the relationship that grew between Sarah and Fergie. And in those early years of Diana's marriage, as much as it was Charles and Diana, there was what they called the Fab Four. It was sort of many different sort of public appearances and even appearances in their private life of Diana and Charles and Fergie and Andrew. Before it all went super sour, it was the four of them. And then as the years went by, Diana almost seemed a little bit jealous of Fergie. There was a little bit of that factored in because Fergie seemed to get on with the royals better than Diana did. Fergie was good at like some of the sports that the royals were into, like horseback riding and skiing and stuff. And Diana was a little bit removed from that. And Fergie's personality was more bubbly and joyous, and Diana wasn't really that. So there was that sort of rivalry that began. And then in the year leading up to Diana's death, it seemed like Fergie and Diana didn't at all, because according to the scuttlebutt, Fergie had written an autobiography and Diana did not like some of what Fergie had written. So those are just three sort of interesting relationships. But my sense is that to a large extent, she was alone and felt alone, which sort of tells you a bit more about some of the hijinks and some of the conflicts she had in her life as well.
Absolutely. And on that theme of conflict, we received a lot of questions this week about her often complicated relationship with the press, the negative aspects of her media presence. I'll highlight one question from our audience member, Susan, that I think is sort of representative of a number of them that we received. Yeah. Susan writes, while Diana did much good in her life, were her tell-all interviews with Martin Bashir and her leaking of the same sorry details in Andrew Morton's book not only ego-driven and self-serving, but ultimately a terrible embarrassment for her children? Or as another audience member put it, was there a contradiction in Diana saying she wanted privacy from the press at the same time that she was leaking information for photo ops?
All of the above, I would say. I mean, I think one of the points that I made in my lecture is that it's all of these glorious contradictions that have buttressed the myth of Diana. I mean, on one hand, one understands that she was up against one of the oldest of institutions, the gray old men of the palace courts, for her to get her side out. And she was so deeply hurt because of this ongoing affair and feeling like she was being silenced by the royals in general, to get her side of the story out, to win in a sense in terms of getting her own narrative out there. She did sort of befriend a lot of journalists, and she did sort of open up this essentially what was a Pandora's box. I think on one hand, she felt suffocated by her fame and by her position and wanted out. On the other hand, you see how like the more she got adulation, the more the public took her side, she became sort of addicted to it. So there was both happening at the same time. And then to some extent, I think it just took on a life of its own and spiraled. And she couldn't put it on a shelf even if she wanted to. So she tried to control it. But the more she tried to control it, the more often it came in, bit her back. If she had lived, one of the questions I would like to ask is, would she regret that interview with Bashir? Would she have done differently? We won't really actually ever know, but because she died tragically so young.
Mm-hmm. One of many what ifs surrounding Diana, and I want to return to that theme of the many what ifs we can't help but contemplate regarding her at the end of our Q&A. But in the meantime, there's an interesting question from Judith Pierce, who wrote in to ask, I find it odd that after all these years, Charles has never mentioned Diana in interviews. Why is this?
Yeah, I think the last time that we saw Charles really sort of acknowledged even the death was there was a 10-year anniversary service, and then there was a rock concert held later in the night by William and Harry. That was one of like the moments where William and Harry really came up to their own, and their girlfriends were with them at the time. And but I mean, like, I guess it's like any family, you know, since they were broken up anyways, Charles and Diana, and then he went on to marry the woman that he had been having an affair with while he was married to the woman who died. Think about if that was your own family, would that man, even if he's the father of the children, be sort of speaking up? I think it's probably been a probably reasonable move for Charles to say very little and let William and Harry be the spokesman, right? So there's that. I think that probably takes us into the next question about the relationship between Diana and the boys. Was there a particular question there?
No, as you say, a great segue. Yeah, and in particular, that question was hinging on whether the media's obsession with Diana has played a role in how William and Harry now interact with the press today.
Oh yeah, I mean that is the continuing through line in the soap opera. I mean, so much of William and Harry's life was shaped by those minutes following their mother's casket through the eerily silent city center of London. People who were there at the funeral just remember the silence. London has never been as silent. You know, the whole city stopped, and like these two boys, especially Harry, who was, you know, so much younger, having to put on this public, you know, performance in a way. And then our relationship as the public with William and Harry is shaped by that day. You know, everything that has happened since, that will continue to happen in their lives, is shaped by the almost ownership we take of William and Harry because of our shared grief of them. Like that was the grief-a-palooza of modern Britain, you know, like the moment where like there was a catharsis almost, like Brits were able to cry, you know, like take off their stiff upper lips. So yes, and you know, a continuing trope, it continues to be of, you know, like making allusions between the wives of William and Harry and Diana, whether it's something they wore or, you know, if they attend a similar event, there'll be a split screen of her and Diana. Like that's just the continuing sort of shadow. During the 20th anniversary of the princess's death, they did collaborate on a documentary called Our Mother, Her Life and Legacy, in which, you know, William and Harry did candid interviews, and it factored in Diana's legacy. This was in 2017. And then more recently, when Harry and Meghan left the royals, so to speak, you know, and he made a speech a little bit after the initial announcement. It was at the Ivy in London. He referenced his mother not once, not twice, not three times, but four times in that speech, using very similar language that his mother had done. So like the strategic use of Diana is not lost on the boys as well. And I think has factored into some of the self-narrative, in particularly Harry, who seems to have struggled with it more. It has factored into his view of himself and his own adversarial relationship with the press. I mean, he sees very much so that the British press killed his mother. And, you know, that is true, but not true. And it's a very difficult thing to relate to someone whose entire boyhood psychology has been shaped by that narrative. Like even going back to the actual death, the last night of Diana's life, yes, the press were chasing Diana, but there were many, many things that led up to it. There was a very elaborate cat and mouse game that Diana took the press on with the press. And we know that that they weren't wearing their seatbelts and that the driver had been drinking. So there was a melange of factors which led up to the death, and there is no neat explanation for it. In terms of the boys and their mother's legacy, an update I'd like to give is about the statue that they has been sort of in plans to erect in Kensington Gardens for a while. It was announced sort of leading up to the 20th anniversary. The statue has not been built. I mean, to mark the occasion of the 20th anniversary, they visited these, new gardens, the White Gardens, they called them. The Sean Harkin, the head gardener at Kensington Palace, took inspiration from Diana's dresses, along with the famous Mario Testino photographs of the princess. But the statue was not up. And all these years later, it's still not up. It's apparently still in gestation. And it has been, some say, the victim of this sort of rift between William and Harry. The fact that Harry's not there has maybe slowed down the process. So we're still waiting for that ultimate sort of permanent tribute to Diana.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And as you say, yes, the complicated currents of public image and inner psychology here that are so fascinating to explore, but also ultimately remain somewhat mysterious. So Shinan, we're running out of time, but you mentioned a little earlier some of the tantalizing what ifs that surround Diana's life and legacy. We received a couple interesting questions on that theme. One from our audience member, Glenn Cohen, who was really struck by the prediction you made in your lecture that Diana might have become an ambassador to the UN. And with Diana's, what would have been her 59th birthday coming up on July 1st, Glenn was sort of found himself speculating about all these many what ifs regarding what Diana might have done in her life. Would she have married Dodi Fayed and just lived life as a billionaireess? Would William and Harry have stayed within the royal family? Would their love for their mother and natural pull take them out like Diana was out? Would Charles continue to have been a bad dad? Would he have married Camilla? I mean, the list of questions goes on and on ad infinitum. So I guess just to wrap up our conversation today, I think we'd all love to hear from you, Shinan, as an avid Royals watcher. Do you have any more thoughts on the possible paths that Diana's life might have taken?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Yes, she would have just been turning 59, and I say just because, like, in the span of a life, especially the careers that people lead these days, that's nothing. And my understanding is that Diana had plans, big plans. One biographer, Sarah Bradford, said that she had in motion like these sort of TV documentaries that she was going to do soon after on the subjects of landmines and other subjects, which is interesting in the light of rumors we've heard more recently about Harry maybe doing the same with Meghan and possible Netflix deal, and also interesting in the way that the royals in general use modern modes like Instagram, like really sort of going directly to the people. I do think it's interesting, and I wouldn't rule anything out. I mean, Tina Brown, who wrote a biography, said that Diana kind of created this power base, a three-way marriage of commerce, society, and philanthropy, quote unquote, which, according to Brown, was a relatively new corporate phenomenon in the London of the 1990s. And it was directly Diana related, and so she might have been on the vanguard of stuff. I also sort of like try to compare her to Jackie O, because I think that's the only other sort of suitable comparison. Like, you know, in terms of, you know, Jackie had a whole second life, you know, possibly a third chapter after the death of her husband JFK. You know, we remember the images of her in the pillbox hat and stuff, but her life, you know, when she became you know, Jackie O, and even after the death of Onassis, what is as interesting, perhaps more fascinating, you know, she became, you know, a publisher of note. You know, she was involved with, you know, many different sort of campaigns, like to like save Grand Central Station in New York. And I think that Diana might have done that. She might have married like another mogul, like Jackie did, you know, which would have given her sort of like the space to do all of this. But then finally, I will note that maybe if we'd actually looked at Diana aging, we might not be so fascinated with her, and that the myth may have dimmed, because the fact that she died young and beautiful, like so many of the great myths, is why in part she's so fascinating, because it's a life cut short. And,
yes.
And we don't know the answer, so we can only give conjecture to it.
Right. Exactly. The speculation can.
She would have been on Instagram, but I can see that.
Right. Well, Shinan, I'm afraid we're running out of time, but as you say, such a fascinating figure in the history of the House of Windsor and more broadly in 20th century history. You mentioned Tina Brown's book, The Diana Chronicles. For any of you folks at home who want to dive deeper into Diana, that is considered by
many a good gateway drug. Yes,
that's a good. And that is a great metaphor for life as a Dianaologist. So I'm afraid we've got to wrap things up now. But as always, a pleasure to check in with you, Shinan. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you again next week.
See you next time.